Warm greetings and welcome one and all in person and online. We're so grateful that you have come here and that you've taken the time and care to join us for today's event, the discovery of belonging in an age of isolation. Those present in person, you've come from many different parts of Oxfordshire, be it from community centres and groups like the Archway, to faith communities, from the universities to counselling services and local businesses. And we come because of our own interest and for some experience, indeed expertise on related subjects. But given our topic, it is very apt that many of you were greeted by music from the Thames Opera Company, whose subtitle is Community in Harmony. The newly formed Thames Opera Company, based in Thurrock, emphasize community and embody a joyous and diverse spirit. They passionately believe that opera should be accessible to and enjoyed by many. Hence, everyone is invited, no matter what their background or musical ability, to come and experience the joy that singing and performing opera can bring. Thank you, TOC Choir, for your warm and vivacious harmonies. I'm Sabina Alkire from the Oxford Poverty and Human Development Initiative in the Department of International Development in this university. But before we turn to the conversation between Kim Samuel and Father Erik Varden, may I please ask you to check that your phones are on silent? And two brief announcements. Today's conversation will be followed by question and answer, so there's an opportunity to exchange. Friends, please plan brief questions, the most of 2 minutes, so that different voices and views can be exchanged. And if you wish to purchase a signed book signed by the author, these are also on sale after the lecture for cash sales at the Broad Street exit. Proceeds from book sales will benefit Alice's Tea Parties. Alice's Tea Parties offer a friendly place where people who have experienced mental health issues in their lives can relax and enjoy just a cuppa, a cake, and a chat. They're held on Thursdays at 2:30 p.m. every other week at St. Mary and St. John Church in East Oxford. We now turn to our event, and it's my honor to introduce the speakers and our moderator. Let's start with Kim. As many of you know already, and others will soon discover, Kim Samuel is an activist, educator, and powerful voice in the global movement for belonging. Whereas some researchers study one topic and then interests shift and they move off, Kim has advanced profound work on social isolation for over 15 years with vibrant curiosity, nuanced storytelling and listening, comprehensive research, and yet a spirit of partnership, inclusivity, inviting people to be with her and not to listen only. She is the founder of the Samuel Center for Social Connectedness, a think and do tank that partners with advocacy and research groups to combat social isolation and build belonging across the globe, including by offering fellowships and holding a triannual symposium. She's also Fulbright Canada Ambassador for Diversity and Social Connectedness, and a visiting scholar at the Oxford Poverty and Human Development Initiative. OPHI works to reduce multidimensional poverty, primarily in developing regions, because where people's lives are battered and diminished by different disadvantages that they experience at the same time, like health or work or housing or security, they may be multidimensionally poor. And long before COVID, Kim had observed that people's own descriptions of their deprivations often include relational issues of belonging, of exclusion, humiliation, or isolation, conditions that in turn affect their motivation and psychological stamina. The pandemic only strengthened the importance. So we recognize, salute, and yet are challenged by Kim's 2020 book on belonging, Finding Connection in an Age of Isolation, which explores the crisis in social isolation and humanity's birthright of belonging. Father Erik Varden is a Trappist monk and the Bishop of Trondheim. Born in the south of Norway, he joined the Catholic Church whilst an undergraduate at Magdalen College, Cambridge, later obtaining a doctorate from St. John's College, Cambridge, and a licentiate of sacred theology in Rome. At the age of 28, he entered the Trappists, making his solemn profession 5 years later. In 2015, he became abbot of Mount St. Bernard Monastery in Leicestershire, then was ordained Bishop of Trondheim in 2020. Father Erik has many niches of knowledge that fascinate. He has expertise in the Syriac language, monastic history, Christian anthropology, Gregorian chant, as well as contemplation. Father Erik's first book, introduced the English-speaking world to Pierre de Bérulle, a French mystic, priest, cardinal, and statesman, emphasizing that far from being wrapped in the hush of an ivory tower, this mystic was constantly on the move, and his life encapsulates servitude as a principle for action. Many of us know Father Erik's 2018 book, The Shattering of Loneliness, which calls on the remembrance of the divine to shatter our sense of aloneness. Matthew Bishop, who will today be moderating the conversation, has many intersecting identities with leading roles in the Brookings Foundation and UN bodies, including how to accelerate progress on the Sustainable Development Goals, as well as work with the social progress imperative. Matthew previously served as managing director of the Bellagio Center, following a 25-year career at The Economist, and he also co-founded the Giving Tuesday campaign. Matthew's first book focused on philanthrocapitalism. Subsequently, he wrote The Road to Ruin in the aftermath of the 2008 crisis, and Economics A to Z, the official Economist introduction. A graduate of this university, Matthew was honored by the World Economic Forum as a young global leader and chaired the WEF Global Agenda Council on Philanthropy and Social Innovation. And a last intriguing twist, he judges the Michael Elliott Award for Excellence in Africa Storytelling. So friends, we are grateful to Kim, to Father Erik for being here and for being willing to converse on the discovery of belonging, a topic each have probed profoundly from different angles. Matthew, over to you.
Well, thank you. With no further ado, I'm going to ask Kim to give a few remarks. I haven't been in this theatre since I graduated from Oxford, and then it was all in Latin. I don't know if it still is for the graduation ceremony. There was no certificate handed or anything, and I guess at the end of it, I was still quite baffled as to whether I'd actually graduated or not. Today, we're promising you plain English and a lot of clarity and certainty and good ideas to stimulate you. So Kim, please, without any further ado, come and share a few remarks, and then we'll go into conversation.
Good afternoon. Make yourself at home here. Is anyone wondering how we got here today? Well, last fall, in planning for my UK book tour, I asked my dear friend and mentor, Sabina Alkire, for advice about what to do differently. What were the possibilities here, having had my book come out in the US and in Canada. And Sabina put a question to me, which was, is there anything that I hadn't had a chance to talk about that I thought was really important? And I answered immediately, faith. And that's why I'm deeply honored to be here today with Father Erik Varden for a conversation on the intersection of faith, community, and belonging. Recently, Father Erik referred to longing as the desire for comfort, the desire to be known, to be seen, to be loved, the desire for infinity that we carry in ourselves. It is through these words that I know Father Erik and I have a common goal and much to talk about in conversation with all of you. I'd like to set the stage by sharing with you what the experience of belonging with faith is at its core and what this means to me. Belonging is one of those things that we recognize when we feel it, but we may not always know how to describe it. In the simplest sense, belonging is wholeness. It's the experience of feeling at home wherever you are. Belonging is the basis for all human flourishing. However, that's not to say it's universal. Indeed, the experience of belonging is subjective and personal. Someone may feel belonging all alone in a room, and another may feel all alone surrounded by people. The point is that my belonging will differ from your belonging, and that's to be expected. That said, after decades of research and listening, I have found that the human experience of belonging can typically boil down to what I call the 4 Ps, that is, connection to people, to place, to power, and to purpose. And I believe that we are at a time when building belonging across all of these dimensions for ourselves and for others has never been more important for all life forms and for Earth herself. We are living through heightened tensions on a number of fronts. We've just seen the war in Ukraine pass its first anniversary, a conflict that has seen hundreds of thousands killed or wounded. We see civil unrest challenging the status quo of broken and inadequate systems. Inequality is only worsening under the current cost of living crisis, with inflation soaring and the cost of everything, from food to energy to housing, increasing at breakneck speed. And all the while, we continue to plunder and pillage our planet for maximum profit. When we look at the challenges facing us, I argue that we need both the experience of belonging and the presence of faith to pull us through and to lift us up. I'd like to be clear that by faith, I'm not referring to the term in a strictly religious sense, because I'm talking about faith in terms of our personal connection to the divine, whether that manifests in a religion, a shared belief system, the natural world, or something internal and intrinsic. I imagine faith as a sacred river where I can choose to sit by the banks and delight in the joy of being. The river is always there, always flowing, always welcoming me back. It's eternal. This reminds me of Message from Home by Kathleen Raine, a poet, a scholar, and a keeper of the perennial wisdom. In this poem, she urges the reader, sleep at the tree's root, where the night is spun into the stuff of worlds. Listen to the winds, the tides, and the night's harmonies, and know that all you knew before you began to forget, before you became estranged from your own being. In reflecting on faith and belonging and coalescing in this way, I also think of William Blake, whose songs of innocence and songs of experience have been among my most constant companions from childhood to the present day. In The Marriage of Heaven and Hell, Blake writes, if the doors of perception were cleansed, everything would appear to man as it is, infinite. For man has closed himself up till he sees all things through narrow chinks of his cavern. We can be too quick to silo ourselves, aligning and interacting only with those we deem worthy. We sometimes call them people like us, as contrasted with those who are not one of us. We see this in our jobs, in healthcare, in education, in our communities, and in many of the systems that govern us. Polarization reigns supreme, and this is not a new problem. We need to recognize perspectives that are different to our own as just that, different, but not less worthy. Our thoughts and opinions are not the central anchor point around which all others must orbit. Ancient separations, like the supposed chasm between science and religion, do not serve us well. Ultimately, true belonging challenges us to break free from ancient separations that have siloed and silenced humanity for centuries. I believe that we can be children of God and scientists too, and ardent believers and curious scholars, seekers of truth, and skeptics demanding proof, and that none of these are contradictions. Gathered here today, we represent a cross-section of belief systems, generations, cultures, and life experiences. Yet, like ancient trees whose roots grow together, we are all rooted in our common humanity, without which we cannot flourish, because we only belong if we belong together, with belonging in faith and faith in belonging. Let me begin here. Thank you.
Thank you, Kim. So we're three authors, and I know from personal experience how hard it is to get a book written. It's one of the hardest things you do. What I want to ask each of you, what motivated you to write your book on belonging and your book on isolation? What kept you going? Why is it so timely? Why was it so important to you right now? Kim, start with you,
Okay.
and then Father Erik.
Well, it is indeed a journey, and it felt like a lonely journey at many times until one day I felt the spirit of the book let me know that it was there and to keep on going. But I was motivated really because I become aware of social isolation, which I see as this feeling of sitting all alone at the bottom of a well. And the more that I saw that in all kinds of different areas, I just came to think of it not as just sad. That's really sad. I thought of this as an injustice. And I thought of this as a denial of people's rights and something that ultimately needed to bring about change at the level of community. And I didn't think that I could do that without giving a go at writing a book, with a view that whoever read the book was the right person to read that book, and that more than anything, I could get a conversation started around something that we kind of put our hand on our shoulders. That's really nice that you care. And I really want to get a conversation started about what is it that we truly value. And when we don't choose, what we end up doing in its place can often lead us to isolation. It just really matters to me.
Father Erik, what drove you to write your book about isolation?
Well, I suppose the most practical answer to that question isn't particularly sublime. It was an invitation from a publisher and a deadline he set. So that's how it started. But the theme was one that had occupied and preoccupied me for a long time. I've had the experience of being lonely. I meet a lot of people who suffer deeply from loneliness. When I was an adolescent, I dare say, like many of us, I avidly read existentialist novels that both glorify loneliness to a certain extent and shows us the pain of it. I'm a compatriot of the great painter Edvard Munch. Everyone will know The Scream. But anyone who's been to the Munch Museum and has stayed the cause will leave it overwhelmed by the representation of loneliness in his art. And so I was conscious of that as a deeply formative human experience. But it was also a theme that I engaged in increasingly in theological terms, in terms of my Christian faith, because sacred history, biblically speaking, begins with a great fracture of belonging. It is infinitely significant that the first death recorded in Scripture, so in the scriptural account of human history, is death by fratricide. And so at the root of our shared history is conflict and violence and the sense of being abjectly lonely. Think of the sign of Cain, what that represents. And then this marvelous story unfolds, which offers strategies, plans, visions of repair, realized sometimes in very audacious experiments through the history of Israel, through its settlements and its exiles, and then in the Christian church, which conceived of itself as koinonia, to use the New Testament term, which is a word for community, for belonging. And so the book was an attempt to reflect on that theme, drawing both on contemporary secular experience, on the world that we inhabit, and to try and link that with the propositions of revelation and of theology, and try and build those bridges.
And it felt a very timely message. Did it? Different. I mean, obviously, the message of the need for belonging has been there from the start, as you say. But I mean, is there something about today that for you made the book very timely?
I think it was in 2018 when the book came out that the UK received its first Minister for Loneliness, and that seemed to be extremely meaningful. We realized throughout the Western world, I think, that loneliness is a tremendous social problem. We see it, and what's interesting is that it can't be isolated to a particular age group or a particular social profile. And we've long been conscious of loneliness as a problem for the elderly, but I think we've become increasingly aware, not least through the experience of COVID, of just how many young people are lonely, and how terrifying that can be. And I dare say there's quite a lot of loneliness in the group in between.
And Kim, I mean, I guess when we first met many moons ago now, and you were first talking about the book, I mean, the image that we both bonded over was this notion of being alone at the bottom of a well, which was something that you had felt a lot in your life. And I wanted you to talk a bit about that and the extent to which faith has helped you come to terms with that.
Yeah. The image of someone sitting alone at the bottom of a well really presented itself to me when in 1997 my father had a very serious brain injury out of the blue, and he was in a coma for 3 months, and he woke up very, very slowly. And I got to see that it wasn't the disabilities that he had acquired through that injury and through that time that were making him so sad. It was the way that people, even well-meaning people, were treating him as different because of that, and not really coming round or communicating, and almost treating him as if they were just so sad and sorry for him. And the bottom of the well and the person sitting there came to me then, and still comes to me every day. That's part of how I get up every day. But it wasn't really until many years after that, when I was teaching at McGill University in Montreal in Canada, that I was being visited by a lot of my students, and I had office hours every day, coming to talk about the loneliness that they were experiencing and that they had been experiencing through their university years, not to say because of their university years, but not feeling that they were getting the help that they needed. And that a lot of them walked around, and you really wouldn't know, were getting great grades and very sociable and all, lots of friends, and really struggling. And so it was one day that I discovered in that time that my métier was teaching. I found it when I was 9 years old. Father Erik, I have to tell you this, I wanted to be a teacher and a nun because at the school I was at, all of the teachers were nuns, and I love them both. I didn't pursue the first part, but I eventually got to the teacher part. And so I didn't understand one day, sitting on a bench at McGill University, that I was overcome with such sadness that I couldn't really move. I had to confront what that was, and I had just met myself not at 9, having chosen one vocation, but met myself at about 21 at university, always with a smile, decent grades, lots of friends, all of those things, and and not knowing if anyone even noticed or could see, or if I could share this. So I came in a, I guess things came around eventually, but it was mostly because I felt that if people, in this case students, were showing up as their whole selves to me and trusting me that much, that I had to return the same, and that really opened a whole other part of the journey.
And was personal faith part of that at all?
Oh yeah, I've always had a faith, and my faith is Anglican. Although I was raised by two parents, one of whom, my dad was Jewish and my mom was Anglican, and I know they made a good attempt to teach us about both, and eventually let us choose. And I just always knew, I think because I was really close to my grandmother, my maternal grandmother, who was the 12th child of Christian missionaries that had been in China where she was born. So you can imagine, I learned a lot through her, but I just always knew I was this funny kid that ran around singing hymns, did funerals for little birds with crosses, and I was about 4. But I just always knew. In terms of the faith part of it, well, that's just, it's like I tried to describe it. I see this river in my mind. That's why it's hard to explain, to say that there's just something that's always there, and you know you belong to that, and you know you can draw strength from that. And I guess especially when over later years I lost my mother, my father, my sister, not too far apart, that that without my faith, I wouldn't have the joy that I have today.
Now, Father Erik, you're part of the Trappist tradition, and which I might ask you just to say something briefly about that, and the role that belonging plays. But it's a very contemplative tradition, and in your book, Kim, you write about meeting Nelson Mandela and him sharing with you how even when he was alone, he never felt lonely. And I think I was just interested to get a sense of, from you, we have loneliness and we have isolation and we have the ability to belong even in those situations. What have you learnt as in your vocation as a Trappist about what it takes to feel a sense of belonging even when you're not with people necessarily?
And I think just considering the words you just listed, it's interesting that we have the possibility to distinguish lexically between loneliness and solitude and isolation. And those are terms which will ring differently in different ears. I think most of us are likely to agree that loneliness is not a positive experience, whereas solitude can be something very desirable. And it's not simply a matter of one being imposed and the other one being chosen. To be a human being is to be solitary. That's something we all face, I think. I mean, even the happiest, most intimate, most harmonious marriage, each part will be intensely conscious of being solitary. And that it's precisely in the meeting of solitudes that this surprising and joyful communion arises. I think one of the things that the monastic tradition would insist on is the importance of accepting one's solitude and being rooted in one's solitude, which means facing oneself as one is. a lot of us spend a lot of time running away from ourselves. One of the slightly unnerving things that happens when you enter a monastery is that you enter a space quite freely, which is a circumscribed area. You cut yourself off voluntarily from a lot of stimulus that previously defined your mode of interaction, and you become quiet. And thereby you realize how much noise you carry, and how much baggage you carry. When I entered the monastery, an image that occurred to me, which is a silly image, but it was meaningful to me, was I felt like a spinning top in a shoebox, and I kept bumping into the edges. And just putting up with that and accepting that was hard. And then after a while, you realize that the spinning becomes calmer, and that it does actually pivot on something. It takes a bit of guts to encounter oneself. But again, the monastic tradition would insist that it's only through self-knowledge, which will also involve a degree of self-acceptance, of reconciliation with oneself, with one's past, with one's remembrance, with one's gifts and one's wounds. It's only by, and it's a theme that you touch very beautifully in your book, it's only insofar as I belong in myself that I'm actually susceptible to belonging in a social sense, and even in a theological sense, in a spiritual sense. So monastically speaking, that is a crucial experience, which will take time, which is why monastic formation is long. But it's not an experience which is unique to monastic life. The monastic life is simply a specialized environment that favors that particular kind of insight that I think all of us are invited to make and have to make at some point. And I think that's one of the reasons why a lot of people look to the monastic tradition and find that it isn't as strange as they may at first assume, that in fact it writes large what a lot of people can experience, can recognize from their own quest for wholeness and integrity and belonging.
Was that why you liked the idea of being a nun at one point?
Well, I was 9. I liked that idea because the teachers and the nuns were one. There was Sister Benedetta, Sister Jean Michael, Sister Elsa, Sister Mary Michael. I still remember that. And they lived a quarter of a mile from where I was growing up. That's where the convent was. That's why.
And you know, I alluded to the conversation you'd had with Nelson Mandela. I mean, what did you take away from that conversation? Because it really was, according to as you write in the book, I mean, that was a pivotal moment in your life.
It was.
Where you really found that your vocation was to really work on helping to bring people into belonging.
Well, I was introduced to Nelson Mandela by Gracia Machel, who I have long admired as a great leader, and especially vocal voice that will never give up in terms of the rights of girls and women and children. And of course, she and Nelson Mandela were married to one another. The first thing that she asked me when I saw her in May 2002 was how had I been doing since my daddy died. My father had passed away 2 years before, and that I missed him a lot and so forth. And then I said that in terms of what I was doing now, because she asked what was next, that really I was working on isolation in terms of, it's a 3-step plan. It's, by the way, this 3-step plan will be something I'll be working on for the rest of my life, in all 3 at the same time. And the first was to call it out, to get people to talk about this and to not feel ashamed for feeling really isolated. And the second one then is to destigmatize that. And the third is to talk to everyone I can to get ideas and call out solutions that exist. Of course, then I looked to Nelson Mandela and said, well, you would know all about isolation. And he said, no, I've never been isolated. And at that point, I thought, well, things were going so well, and I've blown it in 2 seconds. I said, not even in Robben Island. He said, no. And this is the key part. Because in Robben Island, we were all brothers working together with a common purpose. I was never alone. And that's when it really hit me, and not with crashing thunder or any drama. It was just something that I knew. I had this quiet affirmation. This is what I'll be doing for the rest of my life. And that paradox is still there. How can somebody that is in the harshest conditions, a prison, and for 27 years, and 19 of which in Robben Island, how could they feel lonely sometimes, but not isolated, and not terribly unlike what you're talking about, Father Erik, is what it is to live in community and maybe not even be speaking to one another, but knowing that you are deeply connected, and that I wanted to see what I could do to bring around that kind of feeling for people who don't have it, as opposed to the other, which is that feeling of I don't matter at all.
And in the book, I mean, it's full of stories of different communities, different individuals who've been isolated, excluded, and who are in different ways, you're trying to find and tell the stories of the solutions that have been found to help them belong. But I wanted to pick up with both of you. I mean, you particularly, in your introductory remarks, you quoted Catherine Raine and the notion of estrangement from ourselves, which we've been touching on, but this sort of mental health crisis that we're going through at the moment, and this sense that social media has played a huge role, because even though we're apparently more connected than ever before, we feel more estranged from ourselves and many of our fellow human beings because of that. What's your favorite solution that you write around the book in terms of where something positive is being done around mental health?
I don't have a favorite, but I might mention the first one that comes to mind, which comes from Zimbabwe. A psychiatrist named Dixon Shabanda realized many years ago that there was a real super shortage of people that were mental health practitioners, and that there were many solutions possibly, but only one that seemed natural and that was grandmothers. Whether or not you are an actual grandmother with your grandchildren, or whether you're simply someone who has that wisdom and the time to listen and to not be prescriptive. And so with the help of others, all the solutions I point to are really co-creations. He created a program called the Friendship Bench, which puts grandmothers on benches. It's not a code for anything. They're actual benches, and they could be anywhere in a community. And they're trained to do a number of sessions with a lot of verification and pedagogy on it for people who may have any number of problems, including a situation at home that they need a bit of advice on, all the way up to problems that might take a lot longer to resolve. And I'll just mention on that one, what I love all of that I told you, but what I especially love is that when if you're they're not called patients, but if you're sitting on the bench, you go through a small number of sessions, and then you're made part of a community circle. And that is a a group that meets together with everyone who's associated with the program. So it would be the grannies on the bench, and it would be people that had come to the bench to get some help, and sitting around in community with all kinds of others that just choose to join. And they identify together what's the biggest thing that needs doing right now. And they go about solving it. And what's really important to me in that is that you're not dealing with a case where someone is a designated patient or lacking in something or struggling with something that they have to get over before they can be a valuable part of the community. They are always a valuable part of the community and are seen as people whose own experience can help to bring about change. I'd just like to add one thing, though, Matthew. When we're talking about the importance of the inner belonging, and today we're talking about faith, which is the first time that I've had an opportunity to do this, probably ever, in connection with my work. I think it's important to note that we have a responsibility to really care and care reciprocally for one another, and that if someone is struggling, in my view, they don't have to suffer alone. We can't live someone else's journey for them. We can't. But what we can do is be there for them and with them, and maybe loan them for as long as they want it, or give them some of our belonging and that feeling to help them through.
Father Erik, I mean, as you look at the mental health crisis, I mean, do you see that as fundamentally a spiritual crisis, or is it more?
I think it certainly has a spiritual dimension. But I'd like to start by picking up the word you mentioned, Matthew, which I think is an important one, of connectedness. And connectedness, to me anyway, isn't necessarily a very positive word. I can be connected to something by a leash or by a chain, or I can be connected to a gadget that I carry in my hand. The monastery to which I have the privilege to belong is out in the middle of the Leicestershire country, and there isn't a phone signal. From the abbot's office, I had a view on a part of the guest house gardens, and it always amused me on a Friday when new guests tended to arrive to see them out there with their iPads, like inverted water diviners, hoping to find a signal somewhere and being terrified that there being none. And some people just went home. One hears of, and I know one or two personally, people who can't sleep if they haven't got their phone in their hand. That is a kind of connectedness that I think it is wise to question. Belonging stands for something quite different. I think I'm right in saying, because it's an old word, and at the center of it, obviously, you have the root long, which indicates distance, something which is far away. Langen, both in medieval German and in Old English, meant to move towards that which is far away. So belonging is not static, it's not being attached or connected to something which is here, but it is being in movement, and being in movement not on my own. That is, it's moving towards a goal and it's moving towards a purpose. And in terms of mental health, I think that is an absolutely crucial dimension, to rediscover a sense of purpose. Anyone who's been down in the dumps knows that that's what happens. You feel that nothing matters and that one isn't good for anything. Then there's no purpose to me. So rediscovering that is important. Rediscovering that there's something worth moving towards and living for. And discovering also that there may, in fact, be a purpose to the experience of being at the bottom of the well. That pain can also be purposeful, even though it may not be understandable. So I think at that intersection, there is both an intellectual and a spiritual and a communitarian dimension that meet and intersect. And I think it's unwise to neglect the spiritual dimension of that experience.
Now, Kim, in your book, you look at this issue of the British government creating the Minister for Loneliness that Father Erik referred to. I mean, is your view that that was a good thing? Has it worked? I mean, it'd be nice to find one minister that actually did a good job, but without straying into politics. But did the Minister of Loneliness help?
Definitely in terms of raising awareness. It was also created, as you know, in memory and tribute to someone who was a friend of yours, Jo Cox, after she was killed. This was something that she'd really cared about, especially, I think, because of her own grandfather first and others. And to see the issue of loneliness not be kind of over here. We've heard for years about a loneliness crisis, but to have an attempt to bring this into some government context. I don't know how to answer in terms of evaluating it. I'm just glad that it exists, but I also want to say that there's a risk always in picking one word, and of course I would choose belonging. There's always a risk of having that being siloed somewhere, and I think that when we look at loneliness and meaningful social connectedness, and when we look at dignity and other words that we could bring in, I feel that we're really bringing in the same things and how we value them, that we have to really make sure that these are integrated through and from the very start. So if we want to, for example, look at how to minimize, obliterate, ideally, loneliness, one of the places we could look is in the way that we design buildings, the way we design spaces, the way that the people who are living in those spaces aren't designing them. And I see her with us today, Dominic Richards, who gave me one of the best statements ever as an architect. He said, either you design for belonging or you will end up with isolation. And since then, I've been thinking that's true of anything. Either you design your classroom to have students in it and for belonging, not sort of leaving it where the classroom isn't connected, or our workplaces, and so on and so on. We will end up with something else, very likely. So I think it's wonderful that this was created, and the Jo Cox Foundation and More in Common. I think a lot of people are doing this work actually that they don't know it. Just to add, Mary Davis is here, the CEO of Special Olympics International, who I've written about from the beginning. Here's an organization that is all about belonging. Not that they don't know it, but it's that it's not just a group around the center around, or different country headquarters. It's about anyone, especially the athletes of Special Olympics, that take this ethos out into their everyday lives. That you can't design for, really. That, to me, is where faith comes in, the spiritual dimension comes in and guides us along.
And you touched on polarization politically. The Jo Cox Foundation, More in Common, is really trying to stress the common ground that we all have as humans. But you, in the book, go into, I think, what is an incredibly important phenomena at the moment, which is the dark side of belonging. Shadow side. That many, of the populist leaders, whether it be a Trump or a Putin, they are all about using the language of belonging to deepen the tribal sense of identity, but they do that through this process called othering, which is to really highlight how great your tribe is and how terrible the other tribe is. And you know, I just come back from
Well,
America where Trump is getting his mojo back and calling people who want investments to have ESG factors in it communists and whatever. And so he's, you know, I fear he's going to be might well become president of America again. So we are it's a very dicey moment. And I guess in religion, we also had a long history of religious sectarianism where othering has been very key part of it, which seems to go against this kind of description of faith that you're talking about. So what do we do about that? How do we counter this misuse of belonging, the shadow side of belonging?
Yeah. The shadow side of belonging, as you point out, can look and feel very much like belonging. There's a critical difference, though. In the shadow side, your belonging is denying someone else theirs. And for me, that is not belonging at all. I give various examples in the book, including the way recruitment is done for violent extremism. And it's about speaking a language of I know you, I see you, I understand your problems, and here's something to belong to that's even bigger than each of us alone. And I feel like I don't have to explain why those don't really work and why they can lead to catastrophe, because often the person in there is being manipulated into that position. I know that this isn't really my territory to talk about religion, but I would like to say something, just at least the way that I see it, is that God doesn't start wars in the name of religion. And I think it's really important. I think it's really important to be clear when we talk about the shadow side there, that in any religion, in any group with a hierarchy, with a structure, and with power to choose how to use it for the benefit of all or not, can end up behaving in a way that is anything but the word that is coming and faith in the first place. So I think we know when that happens. So the answer for me is how to stop it is to call it out and to stand up.
And do you have a specific example in the book that you refer to?
Well, I've mentioned about the recruitment for violent extremism. I'll give another one, which is a man called Rex Molefe. And Rex is from South Africa. And Rex he was an orphan. He didn't really have anyone watching out for him when he was young. And he ended up becoming a child soldier in a few different parts of the world. And I got to interview Rex, and Rex is also a friend, so we shared quite a lot. He found this belonging, this what I'm calling the shadow side, because this was a family. This gave him a purpose. These were his people. This gave him something to belong to and to be part of and even to be proud of, until he realized what devastation was being caused. And Rex is a beautiful story, because he has his belonging now. But what Rex will tell you is his belonging is devoting his life to young people who don't have those support structures, who often don't have the family members there for them, for young people that are hungry. And it would be a whole different hour and a half to spend about how we still really let down our children by not thinking of all of the world's children as our own. But in Rex's story, I don't think, when you talk about the importance of this, the way the bottom of the well can actually befriend, in a way, not everybody, but for Rex, it was having to hit that low in order to find his purpose and his calling. And I know that he's helped change hundreds of lives as a result.
And Father Erik, I mean, from the perspective of the history of religious sectarianism and using faith as a way to divide rather than to unite, I mean, what are your reflections on how we, the mistakes that can be made and how we avoid those?
Well, I think the criterion of authenticity is hospitality. Whether or not I'm
I hope you're going to
capable
tell
of
us about
hospitality.
why you serve beer instead of milk now at your.
We may come to that later. You referred earlier on to the monastery as a self-contained community where belonging is practiced in an extreme manner. One lives cooped up with a crowd of very unlikely other people, and for life. And there is always a risk in any small community that one becomes self-referential, and that one's horizon shrinks. And so it is extremely significant that in the Rules of Benedict, which is the foundation of monastic life in the West, St. Benedict simply states as a fact. He doesn't recommend it as a practice, he states it as a fact. He says, a monastery is never without guests. That's just the way it is. And the door is always open, and he says, and any guest who presents himself or herself is to be received as Christ himself, which, when you think about it, is quite a tall order. And thereby, this enclosed, clearly defined, clearly delimited community becomes a space where others are welcome in, perhaps to find a rootedness themselves. There's an admirable Swiss woman called Maria Gysi, who founded a small Orthodox monastery in Whitby that existed until not so long ago. It's closed now, unfortunately. In one of her letters that are very readable, she says, I had a dream last night, and I had this vision of myself and the sort of person I want to be as a human being and as a nun. And she said, I saw myself as a large old house where there's always a candle burning in the window so that people can see that there's someone there, and where they're always welcome in, even if they forget to take their boots off. And I think any church, any religious community needs to operate on those terms, which are biblical terms. There's always, I mean, we live on the assumption so often that the stranger is an enemy, or at least a menace. Primo Levi speaks about that in If This Is a Man. He says, that's a basic assumption of human societies very often. And he says, if that assumption becomes the major premise in a syllogism, then you have the concentration camp, basically. But we need to keep reminding ourselves that the stranger isn't necessarily an enemy, which is why the Hebrew narrative of the book of Genesis, which happens to be the liturgical reading for today, is the great call to Abraham, Lech lecha, go out, leave everything which is familiar, leave Mesopotamia, leave your father's house, leave everything that constitutes your belonging, and go to the land that I shall show you. And so, in Jewish tradition, which the Christian tradition has adopted, we're constantly invited to remind ourselves that our father was a wandering Aramean, and I'm a stranger on this earth. So the stranger is not necessarily the other, but the stranger am I. And even as I hope for and reach out for the hospitality of the other, I'm invited to practice that hospitality, be it simply by way of basic empathy, by being prepared as a matter of attitude to imagine myself in the shoes of another. An example of that this year, which has moved me deeply, was from a report on the BBC World Service one morning in the summer, I think, from Ukraine, where there'd been a massive confrontation and a lot of Russian troops had perished. President Zelensky was interviewed, and it was a triumph for the Ukrainian army. And obviously, that was a pleasing result for him. And then he was asked to comment on the fact that there were so many Russian casualties, and he said, you know, that gives me no joy, because those young men also had fathers. And I thought to myself, for a head of state in a situation of war, to be able to have that degree of empathetic intelligence is extraordinary. And I think that too is an example of the sort of hospitality that I'm talking about, and that I think we need to use as a constant corrective just when we regard our own lives and our societies.
But it's almost, I mean, for you, that's the sort of true test of faith, is whether you're open to and hospitable.
Do I build a wall or do I put a candle in the window? That's a choice we all have to make every day.
In about 5 or 10 minutes, we're going to throw it open to audience questions. So please do start thinking of what you want to ask to speakers this afternoon. But I want to come back to your 4 Ps, Kim, that you identify as the key to belonging, and particularly just to first zero in on place and the importance of. I suppose one of the themes of the 20th century was how we became more and more disconnected from where we grew up, and people became much more mobile and left their original place. And as a species, we became more and more disconnected from stewardship of our planet as well, which produces the crisis the emergency that we're in planetary-wise at the moment. I mean, what do you? And you interviewed some amazing people like Wendell Berry for the book, who really, I think, has a very profound series of insights to share. But I mean, what for you do we need to do to restore our sense of belonging to place?
Well, I think that it begins by seeing ourselves not as separate, another one of those separations that doesn't really have to exist, and to see ourselves in relationship with other people, but also in relationship with the places we occupy. So for me, my greatest sense of place is really just about anywhere in nature. Others may feel that way, others may have a different one, but it's about going back and thinking about what it is that makes us feel fulfilled. One of the things I think that is to have this meaningful connection with one another. We know this, and we know what we feel like when we're not in solitude, but when we feel that we don't have any choice in any connection at all, even when we're alone. That what we can do, I mentioned about design, for example, to design our places not only with people in mind, but have the people in mind do the designing for where they want to be. I think that if we can build places, knowing that our population is getting bigger and bigger, where we can have communities even within large places, we have a better chance of bringing around that close connection. And from this university is Robin Dunbar, who created the Dunbar number, which is researched through history to say that we do really well in groups of about 150 people. That works really well. In community, well, we don't always get to choose that. It's sometimes hard to even meet your neighbors in your own street who may not want to open the door because they don't know what you want, or even that you're their neighbor on the street. But I think that we have to start somewhere in all of this, and we have to imagine what it is that we would like to build, and to build it together. Now, I know that sounds really simple, but as we look at gentrification, as we look at communities, tract housing communities that have no individuality and very little greenery, and what happens to the agricultural land, is we look at the world standard about let's have consultation. Consultation can sometimes just mean approval. So when we talk about connection, I would say meaning in a meaningful way from one to another, I think we have to begin with that respect and that understanding that what I may desire is different than what you desire, but maybe not too different, that we can't compromise. And in the end, we have to imagine something different, because if we don't imagine it, it's never going to be.
And you're a Canadian, a proud Canadian, and I think one of the striking aspects of some of the symposiums you've held that I've attended that is the role that you've given to Indigenous people, the leaders of First Nations in Canada, which is obviously one of the aspects of Canada that doesn't fit to the normal stereotype of Canada being a nice place. I mean, they've treated the First Nations appallingly, and lost, I think, as a result of that, a lot of the connection with the land, with the ancient wisdoms of that country. How do you feel the world should be re-engaging with those kinds of the First Nation leaders and so forth?
And Indigenous peoples around the world. Well, I think the first is, and I appreciated the compliment of me inviting or what I've done. I've done nothing. All I've done is to know that this role for me is simply one of holding space, of holding a space. Not to say that it's my space, it's to really build relationship and build relationships. So hopefully someone might trust me enough to include them or give me a chance in a dialogue, coming with this is very important, coming with no solution for anything. But I believe it doesn't matter, because the community will have the solution in their own and on their own. And gosh, I mean, in terms of Indigenous people in Canada and around the world, not only has the history really been appalling, and talk about othering, and talk about making someone less than, and so on, and instead of revering one's differences, we could also be learning so much about how to live in balance with Mother Earth, and at the same time to support entrepreneurship, to support people's right to develop their own education, to look again at land rights, and not assume that reparations only take one form. But it's really about trust, Matthew. And when I talk about belonging, I've been thinking as we've been talking, Father Erik, that what keeps coming up in me is that having trust in one's self and getting to know oneself, and with all of one's faults and attributes and so on, but really to understand that one of the best things that we can do is to really listen more than anything to what people are telling us, and to believe them and to honor them, and hopefully to be able to have the same in return. But it's the reciprocity, and I don't have an answer. As I said to Father Erik yesterday, over all these years, I'm not sure that I've come up with answers, and I'm all right with that. I've come up with better questions.
You mentioned the reparations, and I suppose one of the things that I've come away with from reading your book and from looking into your work as well is but particularly this sense that so much of the isolation, disconnectedness that is going on at the moment is because we live in a system that has a history of fracturing belonging and exploitation, extraction. Our whole, arguably large parts of our economic system are based on exploitation. First Nations have been plundered, people have been enslaved in history and so forth. And, I think one of the things that I always admired Desmond Tutu for was that he set up this Truth and Reconciliation Commission in South Africa. And I just wonder now, like, given the kind of issues that the world is facing, whether it be, our complete failure to manage our planet, look after our planet properly, through to some of the sort of massive inequalities that you're finding in society. What's the role for apology, for repentance, these old Christian ideas? I mean, how do we create new rituals in society that allow us to have the space to actually come and belong together with people where there have been these historic injustices, that so many of them as you look around? And I'll start with you.
I'd say we have some pretty functional old rituals that we could do with rediscovering. Obviously, in the Christian calendar, we're in the middle of Lent, and the great call during Lent is be converted, which means take a good look at yourself. Where are you going? Reorient yourself. Re-engage with the real, and beg pardon for that which you should beg pardon for. Be prepared to receive the pardon of others, which can sometimes be harder, and seek to be reconciled. And I think that, I mean, you mentioned Desmond Tutu's project, which I think, in the Catholic Church, in the Catholic tradition, corresponds in intention to something that John Paul II was very keen on, which was the purification of memory and the recognition of faults that require engagement, honesty, enunciation, and precisely a recognition of responsibility and a request for forgiveness. So I think to have those public processes ongoing is essential. But I think the public processes will only go so far if we don't appropriate them personally. And I think that too, it's always a temptation to put the issues and the problems and the solutions out there, whereas so much, I mean, and the world as it has become in its weird and ambivalent connectedness can give us that sense that there's nothing I can do because everything is just too vast and too complicated and too messy and too grave. But to begin with where I am, and I think that comes back to the basic notion of place. I was also very happy with the role that went to Barry plays in your book, who's a writer I much admire. But it's a matter of assuming the place which is mine now. That being loyal to place doesn't simply mean being where I originated, but it can also mean an elective choice of where circumstance, providence, sometimes disastrous, placed me. I happen to be the pastor of the Christian community, which is extraordinarily cosmopolitan. The Catholic community in Trondheim numbers 130 nationalities, many of whom would be refugees. Many have left their countries in traumatic circumstances. And I can see in person every day the importance of being reconciled to one's own history, being reconciled with things as they are, and thereby being an example of and an instrument of reconciliation for others. But it's only by assuming it and passing it on through encounters that can be realized, I think.
Kim, I mean, the last word to you. I mean, do you think your notion of the right to belong is part of the solution here? That we really embrace that as a movement?
The right to belong, as you mention it, is really important to me as an instrument, and also as perhaps a way of coming to place and coming to equality and to less fractured relationships on large scales. But it's not about it making a new human right or new declaration to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. It's really based on what I believe is a birthright of belonging by simple virtue of the fact that we are born. We all have a birthright of belonging, and then you could say, well, let's ask someone whose birth was never registered. Let's ask someone who never had a chance to go to school. Let's ask someone who is being abused. Let's ask someone who's being shackled, because thousands of people around the world with psychosocial disabilities are still being shackled, and ask if they're able to realize their right to belong. So I'm hoping also that this could be a framework, still early on in the process. But I would like to come round, and I know that we want to have time for questions as well from the floor, to what Father Erik, you were I think kind of guiding us to look at things that we can learn from the past, and including some traditions and rituals and beliefs and practices. And I was thinking about a piece of music that I love, so that's a little bit why I'm mentioning it. But I also put it in the book, and you'll know it as a beautiful composition by Bach. And it's called Wachet auf, and it's Sleepers Wake or Sleepers Awake. You see it both ways. And what this is, and it was written, by a minister, I think, back in the 1500s, originally, when the people that he was with in community were really suffering. And he wrote this as a way about waking up. And I think about how we all should be waking up to what we already know, and waking up to ask ourselves, not just assume these are my values, I can write them on a blackboard, but what is it that we really value, and what does this mean in practice? And I think it's kind of like a muscle, and if you don't keep exercising that muscle, then it's going to get a bit stiff. You may not really be engaging it in the same way. So I think in a world that we've talked about technology that is hyper connected in so many ways, and where I feel we're under so much pressure to move faster, find a solution, find a technology, whatever it is, that it's very important to find within ourselves this space where we can ask, what is it that we value and what matters most, and what does that mean for my life? Which is not to say that there are systems that are not about improving. There's not going to be a good version of colonialism, for example. It was monstrous in a lot of the impact. And as you know, in the book, I write about someone who was a great friend, the late Dr. Paul Farmer, who talked a lot about the hermeneutic of generosity, by the way. And he also said to me, when I was discussing the book in particular, I said, are there any systems that we need to reimagine? And we talked about some of those. And are there any that we can't? And he said, ABC. ABC, Paul, what does that mean? Anything but colonialism. So I think that if we go back to what we can imagine and back to what we value, we're not actually taking a step back. We're taking a step, what I would call bringing the circle round again. And you have to do that to move ahead.
Okay, well, thank you. I'm going to bring Sabina up now to lead us in some Q&A.
Thank you so much. So we have 2 microphones, and it would be lovely if we could have a lot of exchange. So keep interventions quite brief. And who would like to begin? Alex, one over there, please. Is there a second person?
Thank you very much. Paul Can from the Campaign to End Loneliness. We worked very closely with Jo Cox, of course, and she was hugely influential in the loneliness strategy, in that coming to birth. And obviously we're asking the question all the time, so what do we do? What do we actually do? What practical steps can we take? And the most powerful critique I hear is that we have lost our common life, the processes, the rituals, the places where we come together. And so the question is, what can we do to rebuild that? As it happens, some of the most powerful evidence that I've seen about social connection and the value and how you can achieve it comes from actually joining a really nice choir. And they didn't pay me to say that, but it is a question of what things can we almost mandate or bring strong encouragement to bear that will encourage people to come together and recreate the common life that many feel we've lost.
Thank you so much. Is there one more intervention? Yes, please, in the front row, Alex.
Really thinking exactly the same with your music.
The lights on.
Is this better? Yes.
Yes.
Now, I was really just going to repeat, because I was thinking exactly the same thing about music and what a very healing and also bringing together a group of people, sort of without ego, but working towards the same goal, as in a choir or in an orchestra. And I've seen in our community where we live in Wiltshire, there's a group called Create Voice, and it's an extraordinary group, probably like the Thames Opera Company. And they go to all kinds of people singing, and they're singing together, and it's so unifying, and it spreads that same loveliness. That's just another thing I was thinking. Same as what you were saying, really.
Thank you so much. Over to you both. Who would wish to go first?
Well, in terms of the kinds of things that we're doing, you've just given us a great example, yeah? And I think that there are as many ways to do this as we can imagine. I would just add that it's the people that are left out, even when there are bringing groups coming together, and there's people who don't feel that they can show up, or people that are maybe literally at the back of the room and maybe not in the room at all, or maybe people that are in a situation where they're living, they may be together in community, but they and have friends and so on and family, but may be living in what we at OFI call multidimensional poverty. And there may be people, and we certainly know there are many millions around the world who have been forced migrants, refugees, asylum seekers. Well, we could say, well, look, that family stays together and they really love each other and they really care, but it's not enough to leave it there. People shouldn't be living in refugee camps. People should be able to be moving on and into homes. So I would just say, as much as we really do need to identify things that we can do, and as individuals and also as part of our communities or part of our workplaces, I think that's hugely important. I also think that we do need to look at the way policies are made, the way measures are done, and and whose voices are there, and to be able to come up with what I talk about, changing systems, and in some cases tearing them down and rebuilding based on what we can imagine, because otherwise we can end up with lots of community. In fact, being incarcerated is a community. I wouldn't generally say it's what people sign up first. It's as a living option. So we just need to be really clear of what are the other conditions that come with it. And can I mention about music? I'll do both at once. Okay. Couldn't agree more, June, about the importance of music, and this wonderful choir who I've gotten to know over the years, which speaks directly to my heart, because when I was much younger at school, I loved singing in a choir where no one had to try out, until one day a new music teacher came and gave it was a girls' school, all of the girls an audition. And one of us was told that they could go call their mom and go home. And so I want to point out that it's so beautiful to have everyone lifting voices together, and not everyone has to be a soloist. And this is a great metaphor for life, isn't it? That all of us have an important part to play.
I wouldn't have a master key, I'm afraid, but I think to come back to your question, never be afraid to start small, and start locally and see what can I do here and now? I mean, how can I be an agent of hospitality, to pick up that term again, and encounter? And sometimes it doesn't actually take all that much. It's a matter of opening the door and switching on the light and keeping the pizzas coming, and people will gather. So I think there's something about enabling spaces and taking initiatives. I'm struck by the fact that you both refer to the importance of music, and it makes me think of that most estimable initiative founded by Daniel Barenboim and Edward Said in 1999, the West Eastern Divan Orchestra. Said being a Palestinian who grew up in Egypt and then moved to the States, Barenboim, a Jew who was born in Argentine, great friends, both of them traumatized by the sheer pain of the insoluble situation in the Middle East, and the fact that there comes a point when conversation is impossible because vocabulary is just too loaded, there's too much pain, and speaking is at one and the same time too risky and makes one too vulnerable and risks bringing out aggression, so that we must find a new medium. And so both of them being musicians, they had this brilliant idea of founding a youth orchestra. And their idea from the start was to have members from every single country in the Middle East. People who wouldn't normally be able, simply by immigration laws, to encounter one another, and who possibly wouldn't and couldn't speak to one another, but who could play Brahms. And then they made that discovery that having met at a different level, in a different kind of discourse, and having produced that harmony, words could eventually be released. And that seems to me a tremendous parable of the sort of initiatives that we need.
I'm struck, Kim. I mean, your book launch in the UK the other week was hosted by The Big Lunch, which is another initiative all about just getting communities together to be hospitable to each other, isn't it? And you're planning a big lunch on loneliness.
It was the
belonging, sorry.
There's it was at the Eden Project. If you haven't been there, it's a wonderful place about community and learning and what is possible. And thanks to the people at the Eden Project, we created together the first ever big lunch on belonging. And those are important, and hopefully there'll be more opportunities to do that. But what's really important, I believe, is how we come to those events and look at those as celebrations for those of us who are there, absolutely. But also, I believe as a call that we are being called to do more, and that is in the times where there's not a special day or the joy of planning something together, that we really keep, again, looking and being open to the dark corners that may sometimes look like they're being showered in light, and to think about not only what we can do with our time, but also what we can do with our voice and our agency, if we have that too.
Thank you so much. Friends, we are at time, but there is one question from our lovely choir, and so please may I acknowledge the question.
Hello. Thank you so much. It's been a brilliant talk and lecture. I just really was wanting, I can see your face. I was really wanting to know your thoughts and opinions on if you think we can truly belong in online spaces, or if you believe it maybe fundamentally is going to separate us moving forward. I'd just love to know your thoughts.
And could I ask for brevity as we are at our time envelope? Father Erik.
I think it's an extremely important question to ask. And I think online spaces can be places of encounter, but can also be places of alienation. And the fact that they are virtual makes it possible to assume virtual identities and to project an image of self that doesn't actually correspond to self. So I think online encounters are, to my mind, particularly valuable when they can reinforce and enable relationships that already exist. But if they start substituting for encounters, they can be counterproductive.
Well, thank you so very much to each and all. And in the spirit of community, this lecture was very much, or this conversation was a community endeavor by many hands and hearts and minds, by students and volunteers, by staff of the Sheldonian Theatre, thank you very much, by the Thames Opera Company, by Midas Subject Matter and the OFI team. Thank you to our BSL sign interpreters, Marie Biswell and Sarah Hobbs. And above all, we wish to thank Matthew Bishop, Father Erik Varden, and Kim Samuel. Their lives, as well as their work, nudge us gently to consider possibilities without telling us what to do, but opening situations before us and inviting us to consider even the little ways to engage, to foster belonging on the human plane, but also engaging on the spiritual plane. And it's been interesting to have both of those rivers flow side by side. This closes the spoken part of the event, but much of what we did in the questions recognized the importance of music. So I'm delighted to recognize Zico, who is the largest recording artist in Mozambique, whose message is one of peace and unity. He has been at the global symposium that Kim's Samuel Center for Social Connectedness organizes, and will now close off this event with a special song on peace and belonging. He is coming from South Africa, along with Josina Michel, a leader in speaking up for the rights of women and girls, focused on gender-based violence, and she being the daughter of Gracia Michel, that we have also heard about today. So please thank our speakers, and then we will be serenaded by Zico in a very energetic exchange.
Thank you. My name is Zico. You know, artists, even after they say your name, you still have to say your name. My name is Zico. With Michael Jackson, I think sometimes, hi guys, my name is Michael Jackson. But everybody knows that. Okay, the thing is, my name is Zico again, musician. I want to rectify, I'm from Mozambique, not South Africa, but I do live in South Africa. And I want to introduce a song that is the song that is carrying all this movement on belonging. But before that, I'd like to say that there's no humanity without belonging. Can we agree on that? There's no humanity without belonging. So let me tell a little story for where I come from. I come from a place called Mafalala. It's in Mozambique, especially in Maputo. So I was young and we grew up like as a little child. We could go to other houses, other kids' houses to play and all these things, and we'll end up eating there. Our mothers will look for us to find out, these ones are here. Because look at the time. The kid left at 10 in the morning and it's 5 p.m. and the kid is not here. Maybe never ate and all these things, but we were all cool. We were all okay. So sometimes we could even sleep at friends' house. So it was like this childhood neighborhood. So same as our mothers, they would cook. Food was coming from this home to another home. All these things, we go move with our parents to this house and all these things. So I grew up with that, and when we talk about belonging, is where I feel the sense of belonging for me. So these days, it's difficult to feel the same vibe, but thanks to Kim with this project, we can rescue all these things, all these values, because in that childhood is where I could feel my connection, I could feel love, I could feel the belonging. And nowadays with these things of isolation, people isolating themselves and isolating others, it's really not the best. And for what I see is that if we could live life like, for example, we're in a music festival and where everybody's dancing and no one is judging your steps because we all dancing for the same songs, even if you dance funny, but no one cares. So I think life should be like that, and we could find all our belonging. And I would like to find my belonging in this room. And I think we should find our belonging in this room, all of us, because humanity, again, there's no humanity if there's no belonging. And last year, we got an invitation, me and my fiancée, Jusina Michelle, to participate on a symposium, global symposium, which, thank you, Kim, for that. I learned a lot. And it was 3 days program. And the first day, I was sitting listening. The second day, I was sitting listening. And the third day, they said, you must play a song for us tonight because I'm a musician. Okay, so I'm thinking, they're still talking, still before 12, and we're gonna go for lunch, and then after lunch, when I come back, I have to perform. What am I gonna perform? So I ran away, I went to the hotel, I have my little studio, and I started writing a song after everything that I was listening on the symposium. So I picked some words, and I put them together, and I wrote this song called Unbelonging. And fortunately, everybody loved the song. We had a nice dinner when I performed, everybody was so happy. And they chose the song to be the song of the movement. And I'm so glad, Kim and the team. So I would like to introduce the song for you guys. I don't know if the DJ is ready. So remember, we all we belong on this song, on Belonging. Can we agree on that? Okay. DJ, drop it.
We're delighted this afternoon to be hosting Kim Samuel, who's here to talk about her new book, On Belonging, Finding Connection in the Age of Activist Educator, focused for many years now.
My place, my life, my dreams, your dream, my vision. My place, my life, my dreams, your dreams, my vision. Oppression when I say no, prescription when I say no, isolation when I say no, no. Oppression when I say no, prescription when I say no, isolation when I say no, no. On belonging, well I know, on belonging, well I know. unbelonging. Unbelonging. Come on and dance. You come on and dance. Free spirit, imagine the sound, go get it. Free your spirit, imagine the sound, go get it for you. Oppression when I say no, prescription when I say no, isolation when I say no, no. Oppression when I say no, prescription when I say no, isolation when I say no, no. Unbelonging, 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 unbelonging.
More sociable. I learned how to not be so shy, and yet I was going through that again. So I thought, well, what a great opportunity to heal myself, but also never forget that you can feel this way anytime.
Unbelonging, 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 unbelonging.